I just successfully pulled off what those in the industry refer to as a scare or a spook or other synonyms. It's when a filmmaker, or in this instance a Kyle, introduces an image or sound without prior warning. This sudden subversion of audience expectation, theoretically creating a feeling of unease within the viewer. And the people love scares, can't get enough of them really. In fact, there is an entire genre of film predicated on the idea of scares. That's entire purpose is to create this intangible feeling of terror within the viewer. And that genre, of course, is called Rob Schneider comedies. I kid. I'm of course talking about the horror genre, a category of film that has been inspiring the inventory at your local Hot Topic since the early 20th century. The evolution of the horror genre since its codification with 1931's Dracula is incredibly interesting and well documented in itself, perhaps a fascinating topic for a series of overwritten videos. And though the genre, like any other, has given us its fair share of schlock, it's also given us some of the most influential films of all time. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and Brian Trenchard Smith's Leprechaun 4 in Space, just to name a few. But unfortunately, I will not be discussing any of those wonderful films today. I will instead be discussing, at least tangentially, a film I just mentioned, or at least the larger franchise that it's a part of. 1931's Dracula, while widely recognized as one of the first horror films of all time, is also the first Universal Monsters movie, the Bela Lugosi flick launching an IP that would become one of the horror genre's most influential and enduring. The franchise would ultimately give us what would become the definitive versions of Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman, among several other culturally iconic creatures. Its success helping popularize not only horror as a genre, but Universal as a studio. So that's right, you can thank the Universal Monsters for not only Halloween, but also the Minions. Banana. And it's the last film released as part of this initial run of movies that I'm going to be discussing today. A movie that not only is my favorite of its respective subseries, but it's also a film that I feel is genuinely overlooked in modern film discourse. The Creature from the Black Lagoon was released in 1954, launching what would become the last series recognized as part of the original Universal Classic Monsters series. The film, though admittedly a bit cheesy, is a technical triumph. Its underwater filmmaking techniques and superb creature design for Millicent Patrick sticking out against other monster movies of the day and allowing the film to stand the test of time and be relevant even today. It's not that particular movie that I'm going to be discussing today, or even its direct follow-up. I'm instead going to be talking about the third movie in the Creature series, The Creature Walks Among Us. When I hear people discuss this series, they often belittle Among Us, writing it off as some shoddy, low-budget B-movie that lacks the refinement of the original film and rightfully served as the final nail in this franchise's coffin. And while the initial points there may be based in truth, I reject the premise that this film lacks any thematic merit. While I will concur that The Creature Walks Among Us is not as obvious a technical marvel as the original film, I think it's potentially the entry that has aged the best in the series. It's, in my opinion, almost as effective and intellectually stimulating drama as it is a horrifying creature feature, a film that stays true to the franchise's previously established central themes, while also expounding on them and bringing them to largely satisfying and thought-provoking conclusions. Before I get into exactly what those themes are, let me briefly recap the events of the first two Creature films so you know where we pick up in Walks Among Us. Creature from the Black Lagoon, penned by Henry Essex and Arthur Ross and directed by Jack Arnold, sees a group of scientists launch an expedition into the Amazon after they discover a fossil that suggests the existence of a previously unknown humanoid amphibian. They quickly learn that the creature is not only real, but alive, and in a development that nobody could possibly expect from a monster movie, he starts killing people. He also grows attracted to Kay, one of our protagonists who herself is at the center of a strange love triangle, eventually kidnapping her to usher in the film's climax. She's ultimately rescued and the creature is killed, the film concluding with this ominous shot of the creature sinking to the floor of the Amazon. Creature was a success, prompting the release of a follow-up the next year with 1955's Revenge of the Creature. Written by Martin Berkeley and again directed by Arnold, Revenge follows a new group of scientists who take a somehow living creature from the Amazon and place him in an aquarium in Florida. And this is pre-Universal Studios theme park, so no, they don't put him in some strange stage show, or more aptly, a simulator ride. He escapes and becomes your average Florida man, terrorizing a small town and going to old people clubs and things of the sort. He gets another crush on our female protagonist, who again swipes left, and then he is killed, the film concluding with this ominous shot of the creature sinking to the floor of the, hey, wait a minute. These first two films lay the foundation of, and to some extent fully realize, the central themes of the Creature series: man's relationship with nature, his inherent fear of the unknown, and his unrelenting quest for power and control. I'm only going to briefly touch on how the first two films convey these themes as to prevent this from being a 45-minute video, so for a more in-depth dissection, be sure to check out Matt Draper's excellent Creature retrospective, link in the description. The first Creature film is, I think, objectively the more subtle and successful executor of these themes. Though the Creature is certainly the villain of the movie, a monstrous presence the viewer is meant to fear, he's not presented as outwardly aggressive. He is instead presented as curious and sympathetic. He's as scared of the humans as they are of him. He, on several occasions, doesn't show aggression toward humanity until provoked. And through this presentation, the film's environmentalist messaging is clear. The Creature not attacking man until he's provoked to do so is a clear condemnation of man's manipulation of nature and constant yearning for control. I also love how the fear of the unknown is reciprocal, how the humans and Creature are afraid of each other as opposed to it being a one-sided affair. The second film is, in my opinion, not as effective as the first film from a filmmaking or thematic perspective. It expounds on the manipulation of nature and quest for power ideas while introducing the concept of the unknown attacking us in our own home, but it just okay. And that brings us to 1956's The Creature Walks Among Us, a film that, in my opinion, not only works as an examination of these previously established themes, but as an expansion of them. Not only delving into the ideas of man's relationship with nature and manipulation of it for the perceived benefit of humanity, the fear of the unknown, and man's quest for power, but also layering in more overt environmentalist messaging and introducing commentary on cultural assimilation that I frankly did not expect from a movie from this era or genre. Arthur Ross returns to pen the Walks Among Us screenplay, but he is not joined in the director's chair by Arnold. Arnold is replaced by John Sherwood, whose other directing credits include Raw Edge, Attack of the Skyscraper Man, and The Monolith Monsters. One of those titles is fake. See if you can figure out which one. Walks Among Us borrows several plot elements from the first two Creature films with some added Frankenstein influence for good measure. The franchise's trademark slapdash love triangle, or square, returns, with Dr. William Barton sitting at one vertex. He's akin to Dr. Henry Frankenstein in that he wants to play God and create life, but instead of creating a body with his own hands and injecting it with life, he simply wants to transform the creature into an exclusively land species, because he thinks doing so will allow humanity to figure out how to live in outer space?
He's bound to it because he's physically incapable of taking the next giant step into outer space.
This guy stinks. He abuses his wife, is paranoid when she's around other men. He's just overall a bad time. If this movie were taking place in modern day, you just know he would have one of these Facebook avatars. It's as though he's having a midlife crisis, but instead of buying a muscle car, he conducts experiments on amphibians. His aforementioned wife is named Marcia, and she's the apple of most of the men in this movie's eye. She's hit on by two dudes who aren't her husband, and despite her rejection of every advance, her husband gaslights her and accuses her of infidelity. There's this scene where Barton essentially goes full Tommy Wiseau and accuses her of cheating, and Marcia's just like, dude, I want to go swimming.
I'm going swimming.
Anyway, Barton and company ultimately capture the creature and start transforming him into a new species. This irks Dr. Thomas Morgan, another dude in our problematic love square who doesn't want to go about circumventing nature. Barton does it anyway, removing the creature's ability to breathe underwater and making his already present lung formation his sole source of oxygen. When the creature wakes up looking like handsome Squidward and realizes what they've done to him, he's just aloof, in a daze. He's obviously uncomfortable and unhappy about what they've done to him, even attempting to return to the water only to learn of the extent of the experiment. They transport him to San Francisco and make him live amongst goats as they continue conducting their experiment, but before they can accomplish much of anything, Barton kills a dude who's been hitting on his wife the whole movie. He frames the creature for the murder, and the creature, realizing what this Crimson Chin looking dude's about to do, escapes and murders him. The film ends with the creature walking toward the Pacific Ocean, potentially returning to the water despite knowing that submerging himself would result in his death. And that's really all I'm going to talk about plot-wise, as it's admittedly in a vacuum not a stellar film. There's nothing particularly noteworthy from a filmmaking perspective. The characters are at worst unlikable and at best unmemorable, and one could even argue that by removing the creature from the water and making him a land mammal, you take away a lot of what makes him interesting. But it's from a thematic perspective that I think this film truly shines. This movie, which for all intents and purposes was a rushed, low-budget sequel to the original movie, not only asks several thought-provoking and still culturally relevant questions, but takes firm stances on said issues. Where will man's unrelenting quest for power ultimately take us? Does man have the inherent right to alter nature for the betterment of humanity? Is cultural assimilation not only beneficial but essential in the search for harmony, or is it a fundamentally broken concept rooted in ignorance and misconception? These are all questions that are raised and answered in a low-budget horror sequel that unironically features this jump scare. And the film accomplishes much of its success through the character of William Barton, who is presented as irredeemably reprehensible and deeply disturbed. He's a woman-beating, paranoid crybaby with a messiah complex, this later idea displayed visually through his penchant for wearing this neat sailor's hat. He's presented as the embodiment of a lot of what this movie suggests is misguided thinking of the time. He sees nothing wrong with experimenting on the creature and removing him from his own habitat and comfort, as he feels as though doing so will help humanity reach the stars. He's fine with circumventing nature and manipulating it to his whim for his own personal gain. He has no concern for the wishes and desires of the creature, believing that the creature adopting a more human way of life would ultimately benefit everybody. And the character of Thomas Morgan is diametrically opposed to Barton on all of these fronts. He's morally opposed to conducting experiments on the creature and altering the being. He doesn't think man has a place in the manipulation of nature. He believes that the creature can become more approachable and affable not through biological or fundamental change, but by being treated with kindness and respect. And it's through this opposition that the film takes a lot of its stances. This film, which was released at a point of time in which environmental manipulation was rising and a lot of cultures were still weary of one another, suggests that humanity is overstepping in its relationship with nature, and that the key to peace lies not in assimilation, but in acceptance. Barton in this movie is the personification of the quest for power idea that's present in all of the creature films, this particular movie folding the concept into its environmental messaging. He thinks it's his right to remove the creature from everything it knows and alter it for his own gain, an obvious allegory of man's real-world manipulation of nature for human development and benefit. This film was produced at a point of time in which humanity was beginning to alter the world around it at an alarming rate, with over 115 million hectares of tropical forest removed in the 1950s alone, per OurWorldInData.org. This would be the start of a deforestation trend that would ultimately peak in the 1980s. This trend most heavily impacting areas like Southeast Asia, the Congo Basin, and the setting of the first creature film, the Amazon. Barton's quest to manipulate nature and his fate at the hands of his desires is a clear criticism of this trend, the film summarizing its own take with this line from Morgan.
We can learn from nature, help nature. We can make this earth a happier place by helping nature select what's best in us. And when man's ready, mentally, physically, he'll get to outer space. Doctor, there's no shortcut. You can't bypass nature.
And one can even interpret the film's events as criticism of the idea of animal testing and the usage of animal parts in commercial goods. In one of the film's first scenes, our group visits a man who's been attacked by the creature. Though he describes the creature, an embodiment of nature, as ruthless, it's made clear that he only attacks him because A, the man provokes him, and B, the man is hunting alligators for their skin.
I am in Everglades to shoot alligators to get skins. I sell Senor Grant, who buys for men who make belts and shoes in city.
Nature doesn't punish man until man misuses nature. And as explored at the beginning of this video, environmentalist messaging wasn't new to the Creature series with Walks Among Us, but I do think this movie has the series' most overt environmentalist themes. This movie uses Barton's delirium as condemnation of a concerning trend, also using it to raise a question about an idea new to the franchise: cultural assimilation. Assimilation is defined by Britannica as the process whereby individuals or groups of differing ethnic heritage are absorbed into the dominant culture of a society. It's manifested in several forms in several countries throughout several points of history, but I think that the example most pertinent to this particular film and video is the turn of the 20th century United States. According to Pew Research, immigrants accounted for anywhere between 10 and 15% of the American population in the years surrounding the turn of the century, with the Library of Congress estimating that roughly 12 million people immigrated to the United States between 1870 and 1900. And some Americans at the time felt as though it would be beneficial for all parties for incoming immigrants to shed elements of their culture and take on a more American way of life. Not necessarily a total rejection of their culture, but a significant concession of it. And immigrants doing this en masse, according to those who held the beliefs, would result in the formation of a more homogenized and thus, to them, acceptable culture. If you went to elementary school in the United States, you've almost certainly heard of the melting pot theory. This film again critiques cultural assimilation through the character of Barton, who is framed as an embodiment of those who feel assimilation is necessary. He's unsympathetic to the creature's obvious discomfort with assimilating and yearning to go back to his own culture, caring only for what he feels will benefit him. He forces the creature to adopt a more human way of life and, in what is rather obvious imagery, forces him to live amongst goats, a visual way of displaying that those who held these beliefs viewed foreign cultures as basic, as primal, as animalistic. And it's Barton's fate that serves as a final criticism of cultural assimilation. The creature kills Barton before attempting to return to his own culture, again knowing that doing so will result in his own death. It's a deeply depressing conclusion that suggests that cultural assimilation and homogenization is not only unnecessary, but may result in the death of culture as a whole. The film again takes its final stance on the matter through Morgan, this line of dialogue implying that harmony will be achieved not through assimilation, but through respect, kindness, and acceptance.
He's even lost the need for violence.
Because we've treated him kindly.
The change is biological, not psychological.
Well, forget the technical terms, Doctor. It's kindness, not pain.
And with this in mind, it's even more fascinating to consider the time in which this film was released. Again, the movie came out in 1956, just 11 years after the conclusion of World War II, a time in which some cultures were still weary of others. And this is also a time in which the civil rights movement is also actively taking shape in the United States. Now, I don't want to imply that The Creature Walks Among Us is some forgotten masterpiece that should have won every Academy Award in the year in which it was released, but I do think it's a hell of a lot better than general consensus would suggest. It does lack a lot of the charm of the original Creature movie. It's not nearly as technically impressive or nearly as scary, but I do think it's the more effective film when it comes to saying something. And a movie making one or several points does not necessarily make it good, but when it's paired with general quality, which I think is a level of quality that The Creature Walks Among Us is able to achieve, that's what makes a movie memorable. I think Creature from the Black Lagoon and arguably Revenge of the Creature are objectively better movies than The Creature Walks Among Us, but it's, to me, the series finale that is the most enduring. And I think it's only a matter of time before Universal does revisit the Creature IP. I mean, they have been churning out monster movies since adopting a more auteur-driven approach to the whole Monsters IP since the unequivocal disaster that was the Dark Universe. I mean, since 2020 alone, we've had The Invisible Man, Renfield, Voyage of the Last Demeter. If you want to lump in Focus Features, which is a division of Universal, they had Lisa Frankenstein this year. We have Abigail coming this year, The Wolfman next year, and again, lumping Focus Features in, we're getting Nosferatu later this year. So Universal certainly knows that the Monsters IP has legacy and has value when treated correctly. I mean, they are building an entire Dark Universe Monsters-themed section of Epic Universe. So again, I think it's inevitable that they will revisit the Creature IP at some point, and when they ultimately do remake it, I am not expecting whichever filmmaker is at the helm to remake The Creature Walks Among Us, but I do want them to say something with the movie. Obviously, you still want that sense of adventure, but all Creature films, Walks Among Us especially, say something. And while popcorn horror schlock is fun, it's the movies that say something about something that we ultimately remember. And its success in this metric is what, to me, makes The Creature Walks Among Us an overlooked gem. At least better than any Rob Schneider comedy.